Housekeeping and introductions. Today's event will involve some brief presentations at the outset and then a panel discussion, which is sort of the centerpiece of the next hour. All attendees are on mute, but can submit questions through the Q&A function. We'll get to as many of these as we can later on towards the end of the session, but I can't promise we'll get to all of them, but we'll do our best. The report itself, Future Ready Kerbside, is available on the WSP website, and it will be emailed out to attendees following this event tomorrow morning, I think. Please note the webinar will be recorded and the recording made available for attendees. So firstly, to our two initial presenters to really set the scene for this important report. Our first presenter is Mr. Louise Mills, Head of Public Policy at Uber. He'll be followed by Louise Baker, Technical Director at WSP, Technical Director Transport at WSP. Louise is Head of Public Policy at Uber, which globally has disrupted how we think about transport and getting around our cities. We all know about Uber. We probably all use it. Louise is responsible for Uber's public policy program and engagement with regulators in New Zealand. He is a regulatory litigation lawyer and Crown prosecutor by background, and has also held legal and policy roles in the public sector. He'll be followed by Louise. She is a technical leader with a strategic focus on transport advisory, smart mobility, and transport planning. She enjoys the challenge of considering how technology can help achieve policy goals and how transport systems can be changed in ways that improve the livability of cities and towns. So without further ado, over to Louise Mills from Uber to introduce things.
Great, thanks very much, Mark, and kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Hello everyone, and warm greetings and to colleagues in Australia as well. Thanks for joining us. Really nice to be part of this group virtually today, and thanks to WSP, Louise Shafani, Sharon, Nadine, and the team, and also our excellent panelists for being here today as well. Looking forward to being part of that discussion. Uber wants to be a partner to cities, and in order to play a successful part in the transport ecosystem, we need our urban places and spaces to be functional, so that the services we deliver on the transport side, whether that's rideshare or micromobility, public transport integration, carpooling, whatever it is, so that those services complement our urban spaces and also complement urban policy, cities policy, and planning. So we think the kerbside is overlooked infrastructure when it comes to planning for place and livability. And if you've walked around Auckland CBD recently, you probably might think that too. And we think that the reason it's overlooked is that it just reflects a legacy really of building our cities around cars in the first instance, rather than around people. And that's one of the reasons we asked WSP to do this really great piece of work. So we want the curb to be more productive, to be ready for the transport options of the future, shared, autonomous, electric, and other things. And I think most importantly, we want it to be a place for people. So we want a focus on ambience and amenity, and safety and accessibility, so that people can actually dwell on the streets and enjoy the good things that come with living in a city, create that vibrancy, and be in a position to choose the right transport modes to get around when they're there. On the accessibility and safety front, just in particular, I was talking with Louise and Shafani the other day and just saying, now that I'm somebody who pushes a pram around the streets, I've got a small appreciation for what it actually means to have difficulty getting around the kerbside in town. You've got, scooters, people tumbling in and out of cars, big drops, roadworks everywhere, and just fast vehicles. So I think the effect that has on inclusion in the cityscape for people with accessibility needs of one sort to another is quite significant. So I think we'll be talking a little bit more about that today. That's actually recommendation 10 in the report, I think, talks about accessibility, but it's an interesting one. I think just personally, the 30k speed limit thing is a good start, although it's caused a lot of gnashing of teeth and wailing it is the start to making the place more livable and more accessible in town. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks to WSP, to our panelists, and to you, Mark, for moderating. And looking forward to being part of the conversation and hearing what our panelists have to say. Thanks, Mark.
Oh, kia ora, and thank you, Lewis, for getting us underway today. And thank you to Uber for helping to make a lot of this possible. Now we'll go over to Louise Baker from WSP. So welcome, Louise. Now's your chance to take us through some of the key findings and conclusions and suggestions from Future Ready Kerbside. So over to you, Louise.
Kia ora, Mark. Kia ora koutou katoa. Our cities' curbsides are busy places, and they are only getting busier. The curb for our towns and cities is where the street or the road meets the place. It is where and how most of us arrive and leave, and the demands on it are changing. We need to act now to make it work better for us, to make it become more productive, but it's easier said than done. So we need new ways to get our curbside ready for the future. Uber and WSP want to start a conversation about how we can make our curbsides work harder and start delivering more effectively for our people and places. Our new Future Ready Kerbside white paper has been informed by a government and industry engagement exercise, and we wish to acknowledge and thank everyone who's been a part of that journey, including our panelists and many people on the call today. This new white paper brings together 3 key concepts to chart a path forward to plan for our curbsides. These are the shared mobility principles for livable cities, an updated movement and place framework that considers new forms of mobility, and a systems dynamics model that looks ahead to consider things like the share of autonomous vehicles in the fleet and what proportion of these will be in shared ownership. After discussing these concepts, the paper spends time with 2 case studies. Onehunga Interchange in Auckland and Crown Street, Surrey Hills, Sydney, and I'll show you some pictures of those places soon. It explores the future of the curbside in these places and concludes by recommending a series of actions that could be taken now by city leaders in Australia and New Zealand cities to help the curbside to deliver on the shared mobility principles. So what's the curbside? Well, in practical terms, the curbside is the road lane and the area of the footpath either side of the curb. And all trips involve the curbside in some way, whether we're walking, riding, hovering, driving. It's a movement corridor, a civic space, and the demands on the curbside are only going to get more complex with the arrival of autonomous vehicles and drones. Productive curbsides are key to achieving our vision for local places. The shared mobility principles for livable cities are designed to guide urban decision makers and stakeholders towards improving livability for all people. And these were not invented by WSP or Uber. These were launched with at the Eco Mobility World Festival in Kaohsiung, Taiwan, and signatories to these include global NGOs, academic institutions, governments, notably Waka Kotahi, the New Zealand Transport Agency, are signatories, and companies like Uber have also signed up. And we believe that the shared mobility principles aim city leaders towards making better decisions for people. But if we don't want these principles to become platitudes, we need practical ways to make them happen. So we've grouped those principles into 3 categories of process, city strategies and goals, and street design outcomes. And there's more discussion on that in the report itself. In the report, you'll find 2 case studies, and we picked these case studies after a lot of deliberation between the team and Uber because we felt that they would resonate with city leaders. The Australian case study is Crown Street in Surrey Hills, Sydney. Here it is. It's a high street. There's lots of activity. I'm told people go there just to have a coffee on Crown Street and they don't pick a place. And it's got a reasonably hard working curbside. Our Auckland case study is Onehunga Mall. And that's very different to Crown Street, and it's an area in transition. It's the local town centre in the suburb of Onehunga, and it's 8 kilometres south of Auckland city centre. In transport speak, it's an arterial road that connects into the regional road network, attracting local and longer distance movements by private vehicle. You can catch a train to the city or further south from the Onehunga train station, and about 200 metres from the station, which is a big distance if you've got some mobility impairment, you'll find Onehunga Transport Centre on Upper Municipal Place. It's a major hub for Auckland's bus network, and that gap between the train and the bus makes Onehunga Mall a connecting route for passengers hopping between those modes. There are grand plans for the town centre, and these are being led by Auckland Council. The plans cover the blocks north of Nielsen Street, including the block that we've focused on for our review of curbside allocation. And one aim of the planned revitalisation is to spread the existing buzz of the mall into the rest of the town centre. Include a new integrated transport services interchange, increased heavy rail services, and extension of the heavy rail line to Manukau, or a new light rail line into Auckland Airport. And this white paper doesn't aim to differ from any of these. It's conceptual only, and it just provides an example of what could be done with the curbside at the centre of the thinking. So as well as having bold ambitions, we picked Onehunga as our Aotearoa case study because it's typical of so many suburban town centres in this country and in Australia. So to orientate yourself here, I've got some photos on the screen, and you're standing facing across the road, and on the top picture you're looking left towards the station and right towards the shops in the bottom picture. We can just see the summit of one of Auckland's volcanoes, that's Maunga Kea, also known as One Tree Hill to the right, and this area really does hold a lot of history. But looking at the curbside here, the road has some general traffic lanes, parking on both sides of the road, a footpath with some shopfront seating, cycle parking, rubbish bins. And the area of our study, the sense of place here is a bit confusing. Is this to the left? Is this light industrial? Is it a shopping centre? How do I get between the train and the bus stop? What do I do while I'm waiting for a bus or a train? And where's the safest place to pick up a rideshare passenger? So we analysed the productivity of Onehunga's curbside by looking at how it's allocated today. And the red sections show no stopping. Blue is timed parking, and purple shows the bus stops. And there's lots of no stopping, which reinforces the movement function. There's some parking and there are bus stops, and all of this is fixed over 24 hours any day of the year. When we analysed Crown Street in Sydney, we saw similar uses. Both case studies demonstrate that their curbsides could work harder and serve the places better. The private car is only one of the modes that people could use to get to Onehunga, yet it dominates the curbside. And passenger pick-up and drop-off by rideshare, walking and cycling are key modes for people to access these places, but they're not well provided for at the moment. So how might we plan the future curbside in a way that best serves Onehunga's bold ambitions to transform into an attractive urban space? We used a few methods to explore what the future might hold. Our systems dynamics tool was updated with assumptions aligned to the shared mobility principles for livable cities to indicate what the future vehicle fleet may comprise: electric, shared, automated. And we also propose in our white paper an update to the movement and place framework to consider what different types of new mobility mean for different roads or street types. And using the principles, thinking about the place function, we'd avoid on-street EV charging, for example, in this space because we want to discourage car storage on the street. And we might want to reallocate some of that road space to a micro-mobility lane, and the curbside might include some trees to make it more pleasant to stick around. In the report, you'll find curbside allocation diagrams like the one that I've just shown you from my previous slide for both Crown Street and Onehunga looking forward to 2050. And this time showing how the curbside could be reallocated based on these principles here, and some of that reallocation could be dynamic to change with the differing needs across the time of day or the day of the week. So let's take a look at Onehunga and what it might look like in 2050. So do you remember where you are? You can use the road sign to orientate yourself. I'm not sure if this will show up, but there's the road sign up in the middle of the picture on the top. That's the view from the beginning of the webinar, looking left towards the rail station. And right now, this curbside doesn't offer much of a civic space. You're unlikely to deliberately hang out here or meet a friend for a coffee, but in the future you might. Because in the future, the urban realm will be a more comfortable place to dwell and to get to for people of all ages and abilities. As this end of the town centre is revitalised, the street will change to become a civic space. And when this change happens, the curbside can keep pace by enabling more pick-up and drop-off for rideshare cars, e-scooters or bikes. Another view in the future, and I'll read you the vision statement for the place which we developed with our workshop participants. Onehunga is a town centre transformed. The streetscape has evolved to attract more people, eating outside at restaurants and cafes, meeting friends, visiting shops or other services and interchanging to transit. It is safe, inviting and accessible for all to experience its history and culture. The interchange function of Onehunga has strengthened, with more people moving to the area towards the train station. The industrial and commercial activity is strengthened and the main street starts to attract businesses with active frontages. This has resulted in greater priority for cycling, walking and micromobility and pick-up drop-off for vehicles. And here are Onehunga Mall and Crown Street in the future side by side. So there's a lot in these two pictures which I can't unpack today, don't have sufficient time, but perhaps we can pick up on some questions in the Q&A later, so do type them in the chat box. But you'll see at the bottom there is Crown Street. You can see that illuminated off zone indicating that that's a dynamic space too. Our Future Ready Kerbside white paper concludes with a set of actions for city leaders. These are built on the shared mobility principles for livable cities with the curbside and what we have learned from our case studies in mind. I'll pick out one of those to talk about here. I've got a particular favourite, which is the one about number 10, always designing and continually upgrading local infrastructure for safe use and access by people of all ages and all abilities. I just think that so often we come to a place, we see it designed and then we don't really redesign it for another 10 years. And I think the curbside could become much more productive if it was designed to be used dynamically. So I'd like to conclude by thanking Uber for approaching WSP to develop this Future Ready Kerbside white paper. We hope that it will help the curbside to keep pace with people's changing preferences, the ambitions of local communities and of local businesses. And I encourage you to read the paper when the link comes through after this webinar. It's online, it's been published, it's weighty and it's useful. Thank you for listening. I will now hand back to Mark to facilitate our panel discussion. Kia ora, Mark.
Oh, kia ora, Louise. Thanks for that great overview of the report. And yeah, just to reinforce the point about the whole report will be it's available now on the website. You'll be sent it tomorrow, so please look at it in all of its detail. We now come to the panel discussion, which is sort of the centerpiece of this webinar. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and if I could ask the panelists to turn their videos on so we can all see you, that would be great. Just give that a tick. So first I'll introduce Viv Beck. Viv is Chief Executive of Heart of the City. Hi, Viv. Viv leads Heart of the City, which champions a successful city centre economy with a vibrant and thriving heart. Viv thinks gearing up for the city of the future is both fascinating and challenging, and loves the way people and businesses are adapting to the changes occurring in all facets of city life. And yeah, and what a year it's been. Next we have Emma McInnes. Welcome, Emma. Emma is co-founder of Women in Urbanism. Emma is a designer and co-founder of Women in Urbanism Aotearoa. She is passionate about designing fair and equitable cities and towns that work for the needs of everyone living in them. Thirdly, we have Nico Elson. Welcome, Nico. Nico is an urban designer at Panuku Development Auckland. Panuku is a council-controlled organisation. Nico is responsible for planning the future development of landscapes, infrastructure and buildings in Auckland's town centres, so no pressure, Nico. and ensuring these bring about growth, change and opportunity for the local community. He's particularly passionate about creating streets, spaces and places for people alongside thriving natural habitats, which seems like a pretty strong point of intersection with the report to me. Our fourth panellist, Alistair Cribbins, who's Principal Transport Planner at Auckland Council. Welcome, Alistair. You sit in Auckland Council's Transport Strategy team. You started your career in the RMA planning world, and you have a particular interest in land use and transport integration, as well as more recently in how emerging technologies can be used and shaped to help us achieve better cities. So welcome all. It's a really, really impressive panel, lots of experience, perspectives, and really immense brain power. So thanks for being here. So the point of the next 20 or so minutes is to get a really good discussion going in support of the report which Louise has just outlined. So I'll pitch some sort of general and specific questions, and let's get the discussion going. In terms of questions, just a reminder to all of our guests out there, and I think we've got, how many have we got? We've got over 50 or so. Please keep your questions coming in, and we'll try and get to them after this panel discussion. But I thought I might start with a bit of a name that street exercise. And it's a question for all the panelists before I come to some particular ones, but we're in New Zealand, and look, it could be Auckland, it could be elsewhere. I know some of you have lived and worked and thrived in other cities as well, so we don't mean to be entirely Auckland or Sydney centric. Where in New Zealand is a curbside that you think best lives up to the vision promised in this report? And as I say, it could be Auckland, it could be elsewhere, it doesn't matter. You can be as parochial or not as you like. But yeah, where in New Zealand is a curbside that you think is best living up to that vision, or perhaps has got closest to it? So we might start with you, Nico, because you're in the middle of my screen. So yeah, what name that street?
Yeah, hey, thanks a lot, Mark, and thanks to everyone who's been involved with this report, because it really gets us thinking about some of these streets and how we can think better about them in the future. I think in terms of ones that we've done well, I want to jump right into Commerce Street in the middle of our city centre, right at the back of Britomart, where you'll be familiar with some of those pavilions like Karen Walker, the bus stop out to Mount Eden, some of our fantastic micro-mobility options bought by the likes of Uber, right next to Auckland Transport's and Auckland Council's fantastic asset in Britomart that's obviously undergoing a lot of change at the moment. But what we see there is a really exciting mix of the different ingredients of good urban life coming together. There's bits of greenery, bits of shade, places to sit, places to wait, and places really to interchange. And it's that sort of condition of a really good quality curbside that some of our town centres and some of our other parts of the city centre probably haven't had so much focus. If you think about that place maybe 10 or 20 years ago, when it was just a parking lot for buses, essentially, and the absolute transformation that the council and local businesses have able to unlock there, that's the kind of change on curbsides like in Commerce Street that I think we're all keen to see across our cities. So Commerce Street for me.
Oh, kia ora, Nico. So yeah, a vote for Commerce Street. Sounds like the way you've described it, you've set the bar pretty high. Maybe that is a model for others. Emma McInnes, you know, what street can you think of that gets closest to, you know, the vision of the curbside as set out in this report?
Oh, yeah, I don't know about Commerce Street, but I think it's an interesting case study anyway. But I mean, we are quite lucky that Auckland's had a few streets now that, let's say O'Connell Street, where you can actually quite safely navigate that street. It's really, really easy to cross, whereas I'm not so sure that Commerce Street is really doing that. But like High Street's probably setting the bar, I would say, where they've, you know, removed parking and widened, doubled that size of that footpath. And so they're actually acknowledging the demand of High Street that was too narrow for the amount of pedestrians that were using that space, and have really encouraged people to use it again. And they're really thinking about the importance of footfall. They're saying, actually, there's not as many people driving into this area. There's more people walking. So let's cater for them as well as those who have accessibility needs. That street, High Street, used to be terrible. Like if you were in you had a pushchair or you were in a wheelchair, you'd get stuck at multiple points along that street. And now the doubling of that footpath, you can comfortably have, you know, 2 wheelchairs going past each other at the same time, which is a model that Vienna has, and that's why their footpaths are so great. But also, we want to have places where it's really, really easy to cross the street, because pedestrians, you know, should be able to move everywhere, and cars should just be a visitor in those spaces.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, I sort of music to my ears, really. I love that sort of intersection of High Street, where I work, and Freiburg Square and O'Connell Street. Yeah, good places to be, and all sorts of good places to spend one's money, as I've discovered. We'll come next to Viv Beck. You know, Viv knows the centre of Auckland like the back of her hand, really. She's such a champion for that precinct, and so perhaps for you, Viv, your ideal street's there. I don't know, it might be somewhere else. I know you've sort of you've spent a lot of time in Wellington as well, but yeah, what's your exemplar curbside at the moment?
Cross between the two, because I believe there's been some really quite significant development in our streets as places. And I think when I used to come up from Wellington, and I know exactly what Nico's talking about, because the transformation in that Britomart area has been phenomenal, and I think in Wynyard Quarter as well, and the developments around O'Connell and High Street. But interestingly, when I read this report, listen to the findings of the report, I actually think that we're on the road, but we've really got a whole lot of things we need to be thinking about as well, because there's a number of things that we've been talking about for some time that we can bring to our streets that actually we really need to galvanise and progress. So I think we've got some great developments in the streets that we're talking about in the city centre, but I think we've got some work to do ahead to really optimise the curbside. You know, when I think about some of the new modes coming in, and how we actually use that space optimally, and also manage the transition from where we are today to tomorrow. I think what this report is doing is giving us a great foundation to work from now to keep working.
Thanks, Viv. We might come back to that, I guess, that clarion call, this idea of work to do ahead, which is a small statement with big implications, and I know this panel will have views on that, so we might come back to that as the next part of the discussion. But Alistair from Auckland Council, you're in the thick of things, given your planning role, and you've seen the RMA go through many gyrations over its history, and you know there's more ahead. But what's your exemplar curbside at the moment? And I'm assuming it's in Auckland.
Yes, and I was tossing up a couple also in the city centre, which I think is probably indicative of where we have spent a lot of our money in recent years. But hat tip to Panuku, I think, Nico's team, for the work done at Wynyard. I think some of the streets down there, especially around the place making and the integration of place into the streets, has been really good. But actually, I think probably the best examples, I think, in some of our shared streets, such as Elliott Street and Fort Street, where you can see some of these uses change by time of day. There can be loading, early in the morning. But it's also integrating these places, these streets, and making them more like places so people can stop and linger. Stores can, cafes, restaurants can open out onto them, and has created that sort of space for those uses. They're not perfect by any means, but I do think they are probably the closest that I can think of to what this report is sort of striving for and saying we should look for.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I would
Alistair.
just like, could I just chime in again and just say, I agree that none of the streets I think that we've mentioned are perfect, and in fact I don't think any of them would pass an accessibility audit. So I think we need to be, it's probably good, like based on the report, but we actually do have other measurements of good streets that we need to focus on too, and accessibility, for people who have mobility impairments is absolutely should be at the heart of that.
So good challenge there, good perspective there, Emma. Just to pick up on that, you've got a particular focus on fairness and equitability. Is that hence your reference then to accessibility? Why is that so important?
Because we should be designing for our most vulnerable people, because you design for your most vulnerable users. You design cities and streets that work really well for everyone. So that's just the bottom line. a really good example of like where we're doing kind of cool things, like with some of the tactical urbanism projects in the city centre, like on Sales Street, where they put in all those lovely squiggles and planter boxes, which is, you know, really lovely for able-bodied people. I thoroughly enjoyed it, but they had a long stretch of curb with absolutely no pram ramps whatsoever for people in wheelchairs or anyone for a pram to get down there. And you know, so we've just got to make sure that when we're doing these cool things that look really great and look like they're a street that's got it together, that actually we aren't forgetting the people who often most need it, because they're the ones who often aren't the ones driving. They're often the ones who are on foot or are in their wheelchairs moving around our cities, can actually access those spaces. So yeah, I would just say that we've got some cool streets, but they're still not living up to, they're not nearly near where they need to be, I think.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Hey, I said I'd come back to something Viv said, this idea of work to do ahead, which is, you know, it's a big challenge in that, I think. Going back to the report and the highlights that Louise took us through, where she talks about the various actions for today's city leaders, and there's 10 listed here in the summary. Viv and others might want to chip in on this too, particularly our planning experts here who are really helping to shape a lot of what we're starting to see evolve. You know, Nico and Alistair, I'm looking at you. But Viv, this idea of work to do ahead, well, what needs to come next? What are you looking for next? And by next, I mean over the next 6 months to a year, say, when we can perhaps put some of the distraction of COVID behind us. What is this work? You're on mute, Viv.
Have this report, and I really acknowledge Uber and WSP, because these are concepts we've been talking about for some time, and I bet we're all pretty excited about that. And you know, I don't want to take away from the great work people like Nico are doing, and Wynyard Quarter and Britomart, as I said before. But I think what this does is brings a whole lot of things together in a very compelling and aspirational way, because there's a lot of threads in here, a variety of things we've been talking about, with things like servicing and loading and how we think about space and dynamic use, and it brings it all together. And I think it will enable us to actually start thinking about what's ahead in a more sort of cohesive and collaborative way, because that's what we need to be able to do, I think. So we're not thinking about this use or that use or those people and those groups. We're actually starting to think, I mean, I think putting a stake in the ground now as to what the mix might be in 2050 is really interesting. So we can actually start to now, I think, come together and think, well, how do we go forward from here, and how do we bring these principles in? Because I think a lot of it is going to be how we adapt and change and think about these different users and different modes, and how we use that curbside most productively. I think this is pretty exciting. I really have enjoyed seeing this, you know, now, and seeing the findings and thinking what we can now do with it.
Anyone else want to come in on that point? General agreement? You're on mute, Nico.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to jump in on that. I think I really agree with Viv that it is exciting, that the challenge that's been sort of put out in terms of the sort of next year, and how the sort of urban design space and debate is at. It's really around the first principle or the first recommendation for city leaders in the report around co-design. And it's a really interesting term, co-design, because for lots of designers it's quite challenging. The thought that it's something that we leave our expertise at the door and really open up the process a lot. Some of those design decisions that we've considered technical in the past is something that we are being challenged increasingly to really work together with local knowledge. And I think that's incredibly powerful, and it's exciting that we're getting agencies such as Waka Kotahi, NZTA, really through their Innovating Streets process, challenging all of us city leaders to do that better. And the Innovating Streets process is something that in this next year, right across the country, is really upskilling the whole industry in how to do this better. And that really will deliver in the curb space specifically, because there's so much local interest from businesses, from users, from those who have got an accessibility interest in exactly the curb heights, the space, the width. And it's something that too often urban designers and landscape architects have done in a room totally somewhere else, not understanding the local conditions and just drawing it up. So that co-design element is something that is a really live topic, and it's something that's incredibly exciting from my view, that's been emphasized by this report. So great stuff from me.
Thanks, Nico. The idea of co-design, it sounds immensely attractive. It sort of implies that there's lots of players, lots of participants, but just coming back to a line in the report, it says it is clear we have a long way to go. The time to act is now. Again, you know, that seems like a truism, and that's the challenge, but whose job is it to act? Maybe another way of asking this is who's sort of in charge, really, and maybe that's a white male patriarchal way of looking at things, and you've just made the point, Nico, that a whole lot of people have got to be in on this, but this idea of the time to act is now, whose job is that? Who are we talking about? And that's from the report. Alistair, in your planning role at the council, you might want to hazard an opening gambit at that one.
Well, without AT or NZTA, or sorry, Waka Kotahi here, I was probably going to point at them and say it's their problem. They should lead, but no, I think as council and as AT and probably Panuku, other council-controlled organisations as well, I think we do need to take the lead along with central government. It is our land, the road space, and so you know we should be leading those discussions, I guess, or at least initiating them, and you know we will probably be largely funding whatever is coming out of it. So I think it is our responsibility to look to change these, look to take this sort of feedback and these recommendations on board and incorporate them into the way that we do things.
Thank you, Alistair. And Nico, in your area, Panuku, which has obviously played a central role in places like Northcote and Takapuna, and well, and Onehunga indeed, and other places. What's the sort of driving force? This idea of co-design. How does it all hang together to make a better curbside? What's the glue?
Yeah, I think the glue is literally collaboration, and I want to acknowledge groups like Women in Urbanism and also Heart of the City, who through their advocacy and interest in these places are a really key ingredient. And so it's that collaboration both between the public, the private, and the advocacy sector to really get together and solve these problems. And that really, and straight up as a workshop, right? It's getting people together in the same room, using our visual tools and aids to understand the future of these places. And I think this report does that really well. And some of the simple graphics, it shows the different functions of these curbsides and how they could change. That's exactly the kind of glue that we should be putting down on the table. And that's what we've been increasingly challenged with at Panuku. Forming those relationships in town centres across the city, then finding a local place to meet with locals and have those discussions is something I'll be doing from next week for the next 2 weeks before Christmas as part of a project I'm working on. But there are many designers across the city doing similar things. And so it really is that collaboration and the tools and the graphics that allows that to work.
All we want for Christmas is a visionary curbside, Nico. It doesn't scan, but maybe that's what we're after. Hey, so look, just back to the report itself, if you like, as an artifact. A huge amount of brain power and effort and resource has gone into it, and probably everybody on this panel has produced or been associated with or contributed to all sorts of reports over many years. You know, all of us, and often they get read and used in an initial flush of enthusiasm and then perhaps get put away. So what are your ideas for ensuring that this report literally gets picked up and used and referred to, and how should it be given an afterlife after the flush of enthusiasm around this launch period has abated, which you know it may do? How can the report go on getting used and referred to? What are your ideas for that? Emma, we might start with you on that.
Oh, kia ora.
Or not if others want to drive in.
Well, for me, this is going to sit on my desk so that I can refer to it when I'm doing my projects. But yeah, it's really, for me, it's really spurred some ideas about like the next steps and just thinking about how women use curbsides differently to men. Like women walk more than men in Aotearoa and internationally, for example. So we're using footpaths and that curbside space more than men. So it's kind of a feminist issue, really. And you know, women often need the curbside to be waiting for their car share to pick them up after dark and things like that. But if we are just sort of stuck waiting in a sea of parking and we don't have those multiple uses, then it kind of gives us less choice. So it's just got me thinking about where I can, you know, use this as a base and help spur it forward. The other thing I think that wasn't a concentration of this report was the fact that we could be using those curbsides to create more ecological corridors for insects and lizards and bird life and more native planting and things like that. I think that's another huge opportunity that we should be doing in New Zealand. So those are some of the things I think it's really just spurred some extra thought for me personally as an advocate and as a designer.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Emma. Nico, how do we ensure this report doesn't get filed and we pat ourselves on the back for having produced a good report and then whatever comes next? How do we keep it alive?
Yeah, well, I think one of the really crucial aspects of the report is how it's summarised really well at the end with those clear actions for city leaders. And I know that I could use that as a checklist in some of the projects that I might be working on in future, and come across some of those things like thinking about our spaces dynamically. And our streets dynamically, not just in terms of what it looks like and how accessible it is, but how it can change throughout the day. That's a powerful thing on that simple checklist that you can ask yourself as a question. Is that something we have actually really discussed with local businesses? Are there times of the day that they need that access more than others? And how does that link in with the broader mobility trends of where people are going at different times of day? Are the drop-offs and pickups from Ubers later at night? Can we use that data to really pull it in? So what this report, the way it can live on is by reminding us of those questions, and those actions for city leaders, I think, are a really good punchy list as we work on real life examples.
Thanks, Nico. Might just cut across to you, Alistair, because you've got a really important role at the heart of Auckland Council's planning, but you have made a good point about our sort of collaborators in this process, you know, Waka Kotahi and other organisations. But back to just picking up on Nico's point about these usefully summarised actions at the end of the report, do you have a favourite action or two or three that most jumps out at you, given your responsibility and the stuff you're concerned about?
Yeah, well, actually 2 or 3 probably, or more. I think the how actually were really good.
Right.
It's very tricky to pick one. I mean, it's already been picked by both Lewis and Louise and Emma clearly as well around number 10 and providing for all people, ages and abilities. It's something that we don't do enough. I know I definitely don't as a white, reasonably able-bodied most of the time when I'm not injured, you know, not quite middle-aged male. And just by focusing on catering for people of all ages and abilities, we will actually address many of the other sort of actions or outcomes we want to achieve with the other actions, you know, by actually creating a people-friendly space and, you know, sustainable and efficient journeys. And actually by catering for all people, we can actually make it better for the, you know, the average person, if you will. But that's already been touched on largely. I mean, I guess other than that, I would sort of say 2 and 3, I possibly with my transport strategy background had quite a liking for. I think especially the focus on working towards and enabling or delivering on a vision and focusing on that and making sure you focus on your outcomes that you want to achieve, and new and emerging technology is merely a sort of a means to achieve that, to make sure you use it the right way. You don't change your plans to cater for the emerging or new technology because it's a new whiz-bang thing. You look to shape your technology and how it's used in the city to actually achieve the outcomes you want. I mean, the obvious example is, you know, the car. There are many good things about the car. It's had many benefits for us, but there's also many negatives. but it differs from city to city, because depending on how much those cities have been designed to cater and sort of be subservient to the car and being designed around the car. So that's a really obvious example, but with all these emerging and new technologies, we need to be careful to make sure we use them and enable them to deliver the outcomes we want, rather than just to enable them because they're new.
Thank you. And just finally on this broad theme, Viv, how do we make sure the report goes on being useful? Given
well, as I said before, I think this brings so many of the challenges and opportunities that we've talked about for a long time together into one really well put together report with clear actions, I think is really great. So I think many of us have been crying out for some of these things to actually happen. So things like we've talked about last mile deliveries for freight for several years now, and we've seen things piloted. We've talked about hubs to collate things and, operate quite differently. We've talked about technology to enable. And I think getting that co-design and vision right up front, and then working out what needs to happen over time to achieve that is a really strong starting point. I'm a great believer in collaboration. And I think for all of us, this is so vital to the things that we are very passionate about and believe that city needs. I mean, we certainly see many of the issues, even simple things like hearing about Ubers wanting to drop people off before they actually get to the place they want to go because it's too hard to get them there. Thinking about people not being able to access, some of the things that Emma's talking about. So it's really being able to realise those big opportunities to enable that vision to be achieved, and address the issues that, the things that need to underpin this change have to happen. So I think this is a really sort of important moment for us all, and we need to make it happen. We need to get together and work out what we're going to do and how we're going to do it over what time frame.
Okay, thanks, Viv.
I might jump in there, Mark. One way I think this plan, I mean, often local bodies or maybe outside of Auckland, I can't really speak for them, but it might be hard to have a discussion about the kerbside, which is possibly a concept that many people aren't often, sort of aware of. But obviously parking is something that people are aware of, and it's the primary use of the kerbside. And I think a good way to have these discussions is through when parking management plans are being prepared, or possibly, AT's parking strategy and the like. And I note that this week Waka Kotahi actually released a national parking, just looking at it on my screen here, National Parking Management Guidance for consultation. And that actually has a section on parking and emerging mobility trends and does sort of touch on this area. And I think that could be quite a useful way for people to get councils thinking and talking about this kind of thing, and actually not just using it for parking, but what other uses we can use this kerbside space for, and broaden out that discussion.
Hey, Alistair, look, great panel discussion, and the idea of the kerbside, I think the panel's proved that it's linked to an incredible array of issues, feminist perspectives, ecological perspectives, commercial ones, questions of parking, city form, and so much more, all sort of come over and around and through the kerbside. So I know I'm never going to look at the humble kerbside the same way again. Hey, it's 10 to 5, so we've got about 10 minutes left. I think we're having some questions come in from the audience, so I'd encourage, in the time we've got left, for participants to keep doing that. And in terms of who answers them, it's over to the different panelists if you want to. Louise has just come back on, so let's fire away. Question from the audience here. In a Vision Zero environment, is there ever a case to trade off safety to achieve better accessibility? So it's these themes again: accessibility, equity, urban realm, efficiency, parking, supply, and the kerbside area. Is there a case to trade some of these off against one another? Really important public policy issue, I would have thought, and design issue. So who wants to have a crack at that beast? Louise? Is there a case to trade off safety?
If we wouldn't trade off safety, we'd never go outside. So going out and using transport is not completely safe. It should be a lot safer. And I think that when we're designing our places, it's not necessarily the case that we can completely solve a problem, but we have to balance the dilemmas that we're dealing with so that we get the best outcomes for the place. So I would say that you probably are trading off to an extent whenever you're designing transport or places, but it's about making it as safe as you can make it for the people who are visiting.
Thank you.
Can I jump? Yeah,
can I just go back to Emma on this one, because you've got a particular focus on accessibility, which was the first thing you've talked about, and that's got to link straight back into this issue of safety and trade-off. So what's your view on this issue?
I was just going to say, you don't have to trade off safety and accessibility. You can have both of them. There's plenty of cities that prove this point, and we could be doing the same. We just have not been designing things very well, and now we have this opportunity to do so. We have more space because parking is predominantly the use of the curbside. We get more space, and then we have more space to make those decisions. So I don't think we have to trade off either of those things, and they should always be core when you are designing a street. Those two things, absolutely core. Safety, particularly for your most vulnerable, particularly for your pedestrians, and then accessibility for those who need it most.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Here's one that'll go straight to the hearts of all Aucklanders, and a perennial one, because it's what we like to talk about, and it's already come up already, the P word, parking. Here's a question: how do we overcome the self-interest of vehicle parking? The moment that it is under threat, people get very upset. So there's a big question for designers, planners, visionaries, and thinkers. How do we overcome the self-interest of vehicle parking? And this issue's come up a lot in this discussion. So who wants to reply to that question?
Yeah, can I jump in on that one for a start, and then we're happy to keep going around. I think in the words of Steve Burgess from Australia, he's got some really great phrasing around this, that parking is irritating, but it's not important. And the distinction between irritating and importance is a really interesting one. And this report really helps sort of frame the curbside in a much broader way. And it helps us remind us what's important. Moving around is important. Yes?
Nico, you might need to explain, when you say it's irritating, do you mean the lack of? Or what do you mean?
Yeah. So when someone can't find a park, it's very irritating. And so when someone is then asked specifically about parking, that then jumps to the top of their mind, right? Because it's that irritation. It's almost like an itch that people jump straight to it and become very passionate about it. But when you broaden the conversation, much like this report does, about what's actually important in the curbside and all the other things that we need, and you ask people, it's not as important as having a place to sit, or the safety of crossing the road, or the ability to access the things we need in the city. Those things are actually important, and parking is a pain when you can't find a park, but we shouldn't let that pain just rise to the top because people are very loud about it. So I think it's important when we're talking about parking to talk about it in this holistic way, in exactly the way that the report is, that the curbside is a wider discussion with many needs. So anyway, that's enough from me.
Hey, just come to a question that Viv Beck might want to address, because you represent a commercial precinct, if you like, although a lot of people live there as well. But good question here. On the idea of business opportunities. We've probably talked about a lot of other, if you like, non-commercial themes, all of which have been very important, but maybe not purely commercial. The question here more gets to grips with that, and it says, what are some examples of opportunities this sort of thinking, I guess as revealed through the report, will bring for businesses? So how are you thinking about that in your area, membership area, Viv? Opportunities for business.
When you think ahead to some of those changes going ahead in terms of how people will get around, you can see quite significantly different ways that people will arrive and spend time in a place. Do you want me to just quickly first address that parking question, or have you got what you want on that? Because I think what we have seen is quite a lot of change over time towards public transport and moving parking into parking buildings. Because bearing in mind that some people have got elderly people to bring, or young children or whatever, or they haven't got public transport near them, so people are still driving who need to. But there has been a significant change to public transport, and certainly as more public transport's available and other modes are available, we can see ongoing shift over time. But I think in the end, you know, there will be quite a change there already is a change with more people living in the city centre and able to walk or cycle or get around by different ways. So I think we will see ongoing change in the people living, working, studying and visiting in terms of how they get around. So there will be natural change. That obviously there's a lot of growth and space is scarce. So we have to think carefully about how we use that space. But at the end of the day, businesses are looking for customers. So opportunities for people to come in efficiently, because access and being able to get here is vital. That is, you know, making it an attractive place for people to spend time that is accessible is vital. And as long as people can get here easily, that's what matters. But at the moment, it is fair to say that some people don't have access to public transport, but increasingly, I think parking is off street.
Thank you. Hey, look, a final question, maybe come back to, I don't know, the root of all evil or the root of all opportunities, depending on your perspective. It's the question of funding. And somebody's asked towards the end here, is it easy to prioritise funding for these initiatives? You know, the actions suggested in this report point to all sorts of initiatives to help us achieve this future curbside. Maybe it's one for Nico and Alistair just to end with, but how easy is it to prioritise funding for these things? How do we get that funding? Who wants to have a crack at that?
Can I just quickly say that most of the funding that's going into our roads and streets goes towards cars, or goes towards roads. Cars, men drive more than women. Women walk and take public transport more than men. So the roads that we're mostly funding serve those who are really doing that 9 to 5 commute, and they're not serving the kinds of trips that that women make. So we can absolutely flip around that funding and make that more equitable at a higher level. But Nico and Alistair might have some other more.
Just very quickly, thanks, Emma. We're just about on 5 o'clock, so I'm going to wrap up soon, but maybe just a quick final comment on those 2 points, Alistair and or Nico. Is the money there? Is it just a matter of, you know, prioritising?
Oh, you go, Alistair. Yeah. Oh, okay.
I was just going to say, to be honest, and up in my ivory tower on strategy at council, I'm not too much on the coalface around funding of these sorts of things. My understanding is it's not the easiest. You know, a lot of the funding is focused towards projects which end up moving people, and a lot of our, you know, benefit cost sort of calculations do value time savings. Things are improving, and Waka Kotahi are doing a lot of good work in that area around innovating streets and the like. So hopefully we'll continue to see improvements, but I do, you know, I would suspect, without knowing for certain, that it's not the easiest to get funding for these place-based, especially ones where they're looking to improve place rather than sort of your typical mobility and street function. But anyway, Nico, it's all right.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that I don't think there is a silver bullet for funding, and it should come from a variety of sources. I think the city centre's targeted rate model was a really good one, where it's place-based. I think similarly, Panuku's model of reinvesting from other assets in the wider area that aren't being as used, like car parks, and then funneling that into street upgrades and the public realm is a good one as well. But I think Waka Kotahi could be doing a bit more in this in terms of the evaluation manual for the benefits. These are transport related investments we're talking about, and so there's a lot, like Emma said, there's a lot of funding on those big infrastructure processes. What about some of the smaller access funding streams for spaces like the curbside is a real challenge to Waka Kotahi, I'd say.
Okay, hey, thank you. We're on 5 o'clock. I think for the follow-up to this, Louise and co, we'll definitely get Waka Kotahi along. They've been mentioned muchly in their absence, so that's interesting to me. Hey, thanks to all participants. Thanks again to Uber for your support of this work in the first place. Thank you, Louise, for that great summary earlier on. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our attendees and the questions you sent in. Apologies we couldn't get to all of them. I guess the challenge in front of all of us now is to disperse from our webinar portals and get out there and interact and think differently with those curbsides, and perhaps through the prism of all of the themes that this report sets out, and which have been talked about very articulately by Emma, Nico, Viv, Alistair, and Louise. So, hey, thanks again. I look forward to the follow-up. We'll see you soon.